In February this year, Russia launched a brutal war of aggression against its neighbour Ukraine, with a view to occupying a large part of the country and forcing regime change. That initial aim has clearly failed, and now Putin is mired in a grinding war of attrition. His Russian world ideology was supposed to unite the Russian-speaking world into a new post-Soviet empire, but instead has brought only theft, destruction, rape, deportations, torture, and murder to Ukraine. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the topics we cover, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos on YouTube. And please share the links to the videos with anyone you think may be interested in our incredible speakers. David DeBatto is a geopolitical analyst, writer, and podcaster. He is a retired US Army counterintelligence special agent and Iraq War veteran. He served as team leader of a tactical human intelligence team in operations within Iraq and is also a former police officer. David is considered too conservative for the progressive left and too independent-minded for the radical right, which may suggest he's getting the balance about right. Either way, David is a controversialist of sorts, often irreverent, always passionate, and seeks to challenge political dogma and the naked self-interest of certain politicians. He has strong pro-science and pro-education credentials and condemns the encroachment on society of irrational, violent, and dangerous conspiracy theories. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Now, you are writing extensively on the Ukraine war and on Russians' actions via social media. What prompts you to be so engaged and active on this topic?
Well, first of all, I've studied Russia for a very long time, going back to my military days. I just had an interest in that part of the world. Obviously, when I was growing up, we had the Soviet Union, and so I was very interested in that. Eastern Europe, I became kind of a specialist in that area while I was in the Army, and afterwards I continued that interest. So I traveled when it was still allowed to travel into what is now Russia, Eastern Europe, Ukraine. I developed many friends in that area. In fact, when I was stationed in Iraq during the war, there was a Ukrainian medical unit there, kind of a MASH unit. And I met many Ukrainian doctors and nurses, some of whom I've kept in touch with since that time. So I have a lot of what I consider very close friends, oddly enough, both in Ukraine and in Russia from when I traveled there very many times. So I have a very personal connection to both countries, and this conflict has really torn me apart.
Absolutely understandable. It's divided families as well, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And if you've read any of my posts, you'll see that I delve into that topic quite a bit. There's just heartache on both sides of this. As you may know, many Russian families have relatives in Ukraine and vice versa. And that's been that way for hundreds of years. So this is kind of like our civil war. And I mean that loosely. It's not exactly the same thing. But what I mean is it's brother versus brother, father versus son. And it's really torn some families apart. So it's a really incredible dynamic.
And with the forceful statements that you just alluded to there that you make on platforms like LinkedIn, I'm guessing you get trolled a lot by Russian bots, by useful idiots, and so-called fellow travelers.
Yes, I'm very popular among those groups. I've received some incredible blowback, and at first I was not surprised, but a little taken aback at the ferocity of some of the comments. But then I realized almost immediately that many of them were bots, and some of them were paid or even unpaid, as you would say, useful idiots who just do this for a variety of different reasons. So I learned very early on social media to just block them. Early on, I did used to engage them for a variety of reasons. That got very old, very tiring. And so I just blocked them, and I don't usually engage them at all anymore. And that saved a lot of stress.
a lot of energy and a lot of stress and a lot of time, I imagine. You can't
Absolutely.
fight the bots.
No.
So let's turn to Ukraine. And this is an extremely hypothetical question. At what point will or may Putin seek a negotiated settlement over Ukraine? And what will it take to force him to negotiate? Might the use of the HIMARS weapons system and the massive loss of Russian supplies and fighting capacity that they're now enduring because of that Western technology, could this be the first sign of the tide turning? And is this the way to get Putin to talk?
Well, of course, that's the question everyone asks, and they should. And I guess I'll echo a little bit of what Zelensky is saying. There's three answers to that question: weapons, weapons, and weapons. And I'm not trying to be simplistic or silly. The only way that Putin is going to back down, the only way he's going to even think about a negotiated settlement of some kinds, is if he feels a military defeat. Period. End of story. Full stop. The economic sanctions, although they're absolutely necessary and we need to increase them greatly, are not going to stop Putin. And there's a really good reason for that. Not only does Putin not care, he's a billionaire who's siphoned off billions from the Russian economy. He's not going to be hurt. But the Russian people historically have an incredible capacity for pain, for taking whatever the outside world inflicts upon them and rallying around the flag, as we're seeing now, and just accepting whatever happens. So the economic sanctions eventually may influence decision-making in Russia, but not for a very long time. The only thing that's going to force Putin to negotiate a peace settlement or any kind of settlement in Ukraine are weapons. You mentioned the HIMARS system. Absolutely. We're already seeing the effects of that. In fact, there was an intercepted message from Ukrainian intelligence just a few days ago about Russian officers lamenting the HIMARS being put into place, and how many units, how many people that they're losing, command and control centers, their own artillery, their own officers, and how bad that's going to be should Ukraine get more of these systems in place. And that's one of the problems, Jonathan. America's only supplied 8 of them. I think 4 are there, 4 are on their way. Europe has supplied some similar systems. They need at minimum 300 to 400 by Ukraine's own estimates. And right now they've got maybe a dozen or so. So yes, that's going to be a game changer. But I guess the long way to answer your question is a military defeat. The only way that Putin is going to change, the only reason that he's going to negotiate any kind of a settlement is if he feels his life is in danger, and his life will be in danger only if there is a military defeat on the battlefield.
That does seem to be the case, doesn't it? That the elite are not going to move unless Putin is mortally weakened politically and strategically. And of course, as you mentioned, the Russian people can take an awful lot, which in this instance is part of the tragedy here. If they were a little less tolerant of these losses and hardship, then they probably would not have tolerated Putin for so long. And the war was supposed to be over in 3 days. We're now weeks into this conflict, aren't we?
Well, the thing of it is, Jonathan, you also have to remember that Putin he's an evil guy, but he's not stupid. What he's been doing is he's been taking draftees and conscripts rather, and volunteers from the very rural sections of Russia, from the Far East, from near the Chinese border, from hundreds or thousands of kilometers from Moscow, and really ignoring the population centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Why? Because the people in those rural areas are poor, and they're the most likely to want to volunteer for military service because they need the money. The people in Moscow and St. Petersburg, not all, but far more of them, are not liberal, I'll say, but they're aware of the situation. They're more apt to listen to social media, use VPNs to get on the internet and know what's really going on. So they don't want to send their sons to Ukraine to be cannon fodder. So he's staying away from sending units, military units, that are stationed in and around St. Petersburg and Moscow and concentrating on sending people from the far-flung areas, the most poverty-stricken areas of Russia. So no, there hasn't been a big outcry because, to be honest, people in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they don't feel anything. In fact, the McDonald's that closed there has been taken over by a Russian company. Now they're still providing Big Macs and French fries of lesser quality, and they've renamed everything, but the Moscow people are still getting their fix of McDonald's. So that's just an example of how little it's affected the richest and most educated people in Russia. And until they do feel anything, they're going to continue to support the war.
And of course, those Russians who are tuned into the political situation, hundreds of thousands of them have actually fled the country, which is obviously getting far less press than fleeing Ukrainians, which is understandable. But there are now huge swathes of that proto-middle class living in Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, all over the place.
Yes.
And the richer echelons have gone to obviously Dubai and those places which they can afford. So in some ways, those that are more prone to be critics of Putin, they've chosen to run, haven't they?
Well, you've got, yeah, exactly. What you just said is true. There are, by any estimates, hundreds of thousands of the best and brightest of Russians who have fled the country since 24 February. But you also have to understand that there's many Russians, and we don't have exact figures, that are in prison for protesting the war in Ukraine. As you're aware, Putin put a new law in place shortly after the invasion that even mentioning the word war or invasion is now a felony. Disparaging the army, which could mean almost anything, is punishable by up to 15 years in a penal colony. Not to mention that many of the opposition have flat out been killed, been assassinated, and those stories are flying under the radar. So you've got hundreds of thousands of the best and brightest who have fled the country. You've got thousands who are in prison and an unknown number who are dead. And so the people that are left in Russia right now, even if they do oppose the war, are scared. Who would blame them? Who's going to risk their neck to be either shot, beaten, tortured, or put into prison? So right now, you've got a Russian population that is all for the war, either really or in silence. It's going to take an awful lot to get to those people.
So this war obviously has taken both the West a little by surprise, in that the intelligence predicted that it was going to happen, but we believed the capitulation was going to be pretty swift. And the Russians believed the same. So why was the assessment that Ukraine would fall so quickly so very, very wrong by Western analysts? And how did we fail to understand these deep-seated weaknesses of the Russian army?
It's a great question, one that's been asked a lot, of course, and I've gotten into trouble answering this question before, and so I'll step right in and get into trouble again. The reason, in my opinion, is because we lack human intelligence, meaning spies, bodies in Russia, in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, people to actually get into the minds of the Russian military, the Russian intelligence, the Russian officials, and to find out exactly not only what they're putting out in propaganda, but what is really happening in America, and to a lesser extent in Europe as well, NATO and the EU. We've relied for too many years on electronic intercepts, on satellites, and very sophisticated electronic gadgetry, I'll call it, all of which is necessary, all of which have played a huge role in intelligence collection. But we've gotten away from human intelligence, which is my background, old-fashioned spying. And you cannot get into the mind of a person through a satellite or an electronic intercept. You can only get so much. This was the reason bin Laden survived for so long. They didn't use cell phones because they knew that. They used couriers, personal couriers. And we didn't have enough human intelligence spies within that circle to actually get to him for many years. And the same thing happened, in my opinion, with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We built the Russian military up so high that they were 10 feet tall and unbeatable with just unsurpassed, sophisticated weaponry, when in fact it was what it's always been. It's a cesspool of corruption. And the defense industry over there, the generals, the intelligence people, were just siphoning money right off the top, starting from Putin on down. So what they had was a paper tiger. But unless we had people actually there seeing that, and we dismantled our CIA capability, our human intelligence capability in Russia over many, many years, not just recently. We just didn't know that. And what's happening today is the price that we're paying for that lack of human intelligence.
And did that process of dismantling start in the 90s? I mean, for instance, I studied Russian in the 90s, and it was just at the point where British universities were being defunded. Their Russian departments were being defunded because traditionally through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they got money from the Ministry of Defense, or at least, some kind of co-funded money there. That all disappeared in the 90s. And as a result, there were far fewer people becoming, Russian speakers. And of course, there are almost no jobs in the intelligence sphere for Russian speakers at that time.
No, this started a long time ago. I wrote an article, it must be almost 2 years ago, about this topic, and I was roundly slammed by the American intelligence community because I said that the dearth of human intelligence is crippling us, is crippling our national security efforts. And I even posited the idea that it went back all the way into the 60s, starting with the wind down of the Vietnam War. After that, America, at least, and probably to an extent, Great Britain and Europe, started pulling away from human intelligence and putting their R&D funds, their research and development funds, into electronic intercept satellites and all kinds of James Bond type of wizardry, which again, I'm a fan of, but they took most of the money out of human intelligence. They gutted it. And you mentioned the foreign language area. I've been complaining about that since the 70s. The fact that we have so few speakers, and again, I'm talking about the United States specifically, even back then, that spoke Russian, that spoke Chinese, Asian languages, which are very difficult for English speakers. We just didn't have them. A quick story, when I was in Iraq, we had so few American military Arabic speakers that we were forced to hire local Arabic translators, Iraqi translators, to translate for the army. And as a counterintelligence agent, I looked very askance at that. That was not a good thing for me to be having a local translator who was not properly vetted, in my opinion, translate for American intelligence in Iraq fighting their own neighbors. That's how bad it was. Even though we have a defense language institute, of which I'm a graduate. And for years, they knew we had problems with Russia, obviously, with China, and then with the Middle East. And they didn't push through graduates to deal with that and to speak those foreign languages. To me, that's a travesty, and it goes hand in hand with our lack of human intelligence.
On the one hand, you have that intelligence deficit, that lack of people on the ground telling you what the reality is like. On the other hand, we notice this in the media, don't we? That there's this attempt to look at everything that happens through a Western lens, to translate it with a frame of reference to our own societies, our own political institutions. And in many ways, Putin's benefited from this, hasn't he? We've normalized him to the point of not seeing what's really going on there. And those few Russian dissidents like Khodorkovsky, who've been for years saying, look, this guy is a terrorist, and that's how you have to treat him, they've kind of been ignored and bypassed.
No, that's a great point. The American, or at least the Western media, seems to be following the intelligence services and the military. We're pulling back from making personal contacts, personal relationships, which, in my opinion, is what journalism is all about. At least a good part of it. They should be developing contacts. How could they really get to the bottom of stories if they're just repeating what the government says, or just going on second or third hand? I've always had a pet peeve about this in America, that the American journalists always go to the top generals, for example, to get the the word about any operation. And in my opinion, for many, many years, the generals are the most clueless. They are so far away from what's really going on the ground, and what the strategy is, or certainly what the tactical situation is. They should be the last people that are spoken to. But again, the journalists haven't developed any contacts with anybody else other than, say, the Pentagon, the White House, and some of the top generals, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and so forth. So that's who they go to. And do you think those people are going to give an honest assessment of what's going on the ground? No, they're not. And that's what they feed to the American and the British and the European public. So no, journalism, mainstream journalism, has let us down for many, many years. And I actually understand how many people on both the left and the right no longer trust the media, and a lot of it's their own fault.
And of course, those guys at the top are probably, exceptional communicators. So they're able to paper over their lack of knowledge in certain areas with quite, compelling stories. And I've seen this on MSNBC, for instance, quite a lot. I think there's a huge cachet, isn't there? And the people who run those shows get a real thrill from talking to the top brass. So it's not just about ratings and so on. I think also personally they get a bit of a thrill from speaking to these sort of 5-star generals and people.
Oh, absolutely. It's all part of the good old boy syndrome, good old girl syndrome now, where they love rubbing elbows with admirals and generals and the director of the CIA and the director of the FBI and so forth and so on, or the White House spokespersons. But that's not the real story. I used to say that when you reach the level in the military of colonel, you're a politician. You're not to be trusted, because you're looking at your first star to become a general, and therefore you've sold your soul. Not in every instance, of course, but in my experience, to a great degree. So those people are all spouting the party line. You're not going to get an honest assessment of what's really going on. You've got to talk to the lower ranks. The same thing with I don't care if it's law enforcement, if it's the intelligence services, it's the State Department or Foreign Service Office. You've got to talk to the rank and file, the people that actually do the work. And reporters don't want to do that. It's boring. It's not exciting. It's not sexy to talk to a person on the street or an agent or a sergeant or someone. It's just not very sexy. And they don't invite you to cocktail parties in D.C. or Berlin. And so they don't talk to these people. And I tell you, we're losing a lot. And we're seeing that loss right now in Ukraine.
And I guess Russia has a similar problem, but for very different reasons. They also were getting the wrong information from their people on the ground in Ukraine. They were paying a vast amount of officials to roll over when the invasion came. They were paying off a huge number of entrepreneurs, government operatives, and one would assume a lot of people in the Secret Service establishment as well. That didn't work out so well, did it? Because they just received, again, information that they wanted to hear. It reinforced their point of view. And yet, I think a point you've made in one of your posts is Ukraine has become increasingly Ukrainified in recent years. And this is something the Russian officials and analysts have completely missed. They don't bother to learn Ukrainian. They don't bother to dig beneath their bribed contacts to find out what's really going on, do they?
No, it's a great point. One of the main reasons, if not the main reason, that Russia has thus far failed dramatically in Ukraine is the lack of intelligence caused by the incredible amount of corruption at all levels in Russia. And I can't stress that enough, how corrupt Russia is. It always has been, going back hundreds of years. But under Putin, he's taken it to a new level. And this has to do with the FSB, the intelligence services, law enforcement, certainly the military, and importantly, defense contractors. They've just siphoned money right off the top, taking their cue from Putin. And if they say that this weapon system is just incredible and 100%, they will issue any reports they think Putin needs to see about how effective and how efficient it is and how it's going to defeat any similar NATO or Western systems, when in fact it's nonsense. They've stolen 90% of the money. That's now coming out. The same with the intelligence services, as you mentioned. They told Putin whatever he wanted to hear. It's a very much of a yes man, yes sir type of a situation. They are actually afraid to tell him bad news, and they have for a very long time. And so they fed him just completely wild, delusional information about Ukraine, not having a clue about what was really going on there. And they, paid the price. They had a very rude awakening starting on 24 February.
And I mean, another interesting point, isn't it, that now that there is such a huge, maybe not quantity, but a huge range of equipment being pumped into Ukraine, that there's now this incredible variety of different equipment types that the Ukrainian army is actually using, from captured Russian kit to a vast array of systems from the US and Europe. How on earth do Ukrainians cope with that much complexity, thinking of all the different spare parts, manuals, even languages, types of ammo that all this equipment requires?
Again, another really good question, and it's one of the other points, some of which we've just made. We, the West, have greatly underestimated the abilities of the Ukrainians, not just in the military, but at all levels of their society. They've come a very, very long way in a very, very short period of time. You have to understand that the West, specifically the United States, I'll have to say, since especially 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea and went into the Donbass, we have been providing an incredible amount of training for the Ukrainians at all levels, not just military, law enforcement, intelligence services, governance. We have just had thousands of our experts over there for, 8 years now, and they've had just soaked it up like a sponge. Thousands of Ukrainians have gone to military schools here in the States and also in Great Britain, I know, and in other nations in Europe, the NATO nations. So their ability to soak up this information, to retain it, to use it in a much shorter period of time than we thought possible is showing now, is just telling. So the excuses about, we can't send these advanced weapon systems there. They're not going to know how to use them, or it's going to take them months or years to train on these things was utter nonsense. I said that from the beginning. Many Western generals have said the same thing. They were just angry about that. It was a political move for a whole host of reasons. They didn't want to send the advanced weaponry over to Ukraine in order not to provoke Putin. But that's been shown to be a fallacy, the whole provoke Putin thing, which is another issue, but also the fact that Ukrainians couldn't possibly train and use this in a short period of time. Wrong. They are, and they will in the future. We need to send a lot more.
And I think that's one of the reasons I know Germany's come in for a lot of stick as well. I think part of it is they've insisted that the extensive training takes place on the equipment. But in reality, even with 6 months of training, that's a lot less time than they'd use to train their own forces, isn't it? I've heard figures of 1 to 2 years, which is more sort of standard training cycles on some of this advanced equipment.
Those are ideal circumstances. And in times of peace, yes, you can train someone on a weapon system for 2 years. You can train someone how to shoot a rifle proficiently and take 6 months until he's an expert. In a time of war, this goes down to weeks. And it should. It should. Does that mean they're going to be expert? There's not going to be mistakes made. There's not going to be ammo wasted and targets missed. Of course, that's going to happen. But this is a war. It's not only a war, Jonathan. It's a war for the survival of Ukraine, literally. And to be, screwing around with saying what weapon systems we should or should not use because the Ukrainians are incapable of training on these in an adequate period of time is just insulting to the Ukrainians. And it's nonsense. Yes, they can. In fact, I was one of the first people to really shout about the fact that we should have been sending the MiGs and even the F-16s over to Ukraine. They fly MiGs now. It's a very short leap to go from an older MiG to a newer MiG, not to mention that Ukrainian pilots have been training in the United States for years. And so if we sent over MiGs, MiG-29s, the latest MiGs, F-16s, F-15s to Ukraine, they could be taught to fly those in a matter of weeks to months based on training they've already had. And if we had started this on 24 February, we're 5 months into the war. Just think how many of them would be trained and ready to fly these sorties with their new MiGs and F-15s.
And the same is true of the HIMARS system as well, isn't it? It's only come on stream in the last couple of weeks. They only have a few units, and we see some amazing pictures from the front. But of course, once we've seen those social media clips, the equipment has already moved on to another location so that it can't be, triangulated and hit by the Russians. But what we're seeing is them taking out numerous supply depots with extraordinary precision. As you say, if they'd had these systems trained up 4 or 5 months ago, we'd have been looking at a very different scenario now, wouldn't we?
If we had sent the Ukrainians the equipment that they needed, trained them up on the equipment they needed, not even on just 24 February, Jonathan, we knew, at least the West knew, Great Britain and the United States together, the intelligence was spot on prior to 24 February, when the Russians started amassing their troops starting late last year. If we had sent the Ukrainians the material they needed, the weapon systems they needed, given them the training that they needed, I don't think we'd even be talking about a lot of this right now. I think the Russians would have been pushed back. They wouldn't have even made it to the Donbass. They would have, but they would have been pushed back. And now we would be talking about possibly Putin thinking about a settlement of some kind.
And of course, that 40-mile convoy north of Kiev, very little of that would have made it up through Belarus and back into the east.
Absolutely. Just think if that convoy that you saw, was destroyed, was utterly destroyed, like the road of death, if you remember, back from Iraq, when America just totally obliterated all of the Iraqi armor and trucks and supply vehicles that were sitting on the Kuwait line. That would have just obliterated it. I don't believe they would have recovered from that. Certainly not for a very long time. But we didn't do that. And we're still not doing that. And here we are 5 months in, Ukraine's still fighting for its life. And we're still not sending anywhere near the amount of logistics and weapon systems that they need.
And this could, of course, go into, I've heard people talk about end of the year, which is perhaps optimistic, going into next year and seeing Ukraine sort of push Russia out of the territories that it invaded in the last 8 years. That is a long time in a modern news cycle. How difficult is it to keep allies on the same page, in their public statements and their positions for this length of time? And of course, it's got to be noted that Russia will continuously look to leverage any divisions between the allies as well.
Absolutely. It's very difficult. I wrote a couple of articles about that recently, and I'm very concerned about that. We're already starting to see the cracks in the Western alliance, both here in the United States and certainly in different countries within NATO and the EU. They're already having Ukraine fatigue. And to me, this is just unbelievable. In Europe, they are on the front lines. What are they thinking? If they don't stop Putin in Ukraine, they will be next. There's any number of intelligence reports out there, and even in the mainstream press, media, about the fact that Putin will not stop at Ukraine, especially if he's victorious. And these countries in Eastern Europe, and maybe even further, are going to be next. And yet they have Ukraine fatigue. To me, this is insane. But yes, we're starting to see it, certainly here in the U.S. Politicians, especially on the Republican side, are already starting to talk about pulling our resources back, that we need to look at our own problems here. The old saw about why should we worry about a country on the other side of the world. And so, yes, that's a real problem. Putin has always leveraged any cracks he could within NATO and the Western alliance. He's doubling down on that now. I can only imagine how, the people that he's got in those countries intelligence operatives are just working overtime on this, and in many instances they're succeeding. And if we allow that to happen, it's a catastrophe. We just can't. But we will see more Ukraine fatigue, and I just pray that the West is able to hold it together enough to see this through. But to be honest, I have my doubts.
And I'm really going to sort of pick up on one of the points you mentioned there, especially around the sort of GOP and a lot of the politics we've seen over the last couple of years, extremely divisive politics. What's the greatest threat, do you think, for supporting Ukraine in the US? Does it come from the radical left, or actually is the right a much bigger threat?
Well, I mean, you've got people on both sides, certainly, in any country, but in the United States as well, that are opposed to constantly or greatly increasing our support for Ukraine. But I'll have to be brutally honest. No, it's the Republican Party. There's no question about that. They've always been the America First Party. They really, even though they're hawks on defense, it's hawks on the defense that they want. And so if they feel that there's any way to drive a wedge between the American people and the Democratic Party, they'll do it. And so to do that now would be to drive a wedge between American voters and supporting Ukraine. And so we're starting to see that pick up speed, where going into the midterm elections in this country, which are in November, they're already starting to say that we're giving too much money to Ukraine. We should be worrying about what's going on here. Joe Biden is a weak president, and his son has already got business interest in Ukraine. That's why he's supporting Ukraine. We need to watch out for this. No, it's totally 99% coming from the Republican side, and it's not just that. And I've written about this before, but the Republican Party, the Republican voters, Republican officials, militia groups, right-wing militia groups, very often take their talking points from Russian propaganda, directly from the Kremlin, sometimes knowingly, other times unwittingly, but it amounts to the same thing. Putin, the Kremlin, is able to get their talking points across to the American right wing. And it's been going on for a very long time. But of course, it really took off with the election of Donald Trump because of his, how shall I say, his relationship with Vladimir Putin, and comparing America to Russia and saying that Russia's not that bad. We do the same thing. That just started a very downhill slide. And now many Americans on the right have no problem at all with actually siding with Putin, with siding with Russia in their invasion of Ukraine. You will not hear anybody from the Democratic side with Russia in the invasion of Ukraine. You will hear many Republicans, officials, elected officials, as well as voters, side with Russia against Ukraine. And that drumbeat is getting louder. And I fear it's going to be a huge problem here in the States in a very short time.
And dare I say it, there are some sort of Trump generation 2.0 kind of figures as well, aren't there? One can only think of Tucker Carlson, who has perhaps been the most obvious figure to reinterpret Russian talking points, Kremlin talking points.
Yeah, I mean, Tucker Carlson has actually been featured many times on Russian news on Channel 1 and RT, which are the main propaganda media sites in Russia, as being their boy. But as far as politicians, for example, you may be familiar with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is a clone of Trump. He was Trump was a mentor to DeSantis. Now DeSantis is thought to possibly be a front runner to eclipse Trump in the next Democratic election, and he is far worse than Trump, meaning he is Trump, but Trump with brains. He's far more dangerous, and he does not support Ukraine. He does not support, he doesn't support many of the things that the Democrats support, and he supports everything that Trump does. So if he gets elected, or another like him, we're talking Cruz, many of the other people in the Republican sphere, if any of them get elected, it's going to be rough to continue the American support of Ukraine. I would see dark days ahead.
And to follow that theme, I think you've probably already answered this question, but how far can we say that Trump is a Russian asset, either incidentally or literally?
Well, no, nobody could say for sure whether he's actually received money from Putin or whether any of those hotel stories are true. But what I can say very certainly is that he is a Russian asset by actions. He's a Russian asset by words and deeds. He has done absolutely nothing, in my opinion, to dissuade Americans from disliking Putin. He's never, to my knowledge, criticized Putin. In fact, when the invasion just happened, he said that's genius. He used the word "that's genius" for Putin. I mean, what else do you need to say? No, he's a Russian asset in every way, without the possibility of maybe being handed a satchel full of rubles.
Absolutely, and certainly, even if he's not politically sophisticated enough to sort of, really understand how Russia works, he has a unbounded admiration for autocrats. I mean, that is absolutely clear, isn't it?
No, it
From
is.
North Korea to many others.
Absolutely. No. That's exactly why he likes Putin. Putin is what Trump would like to be, but his government and that nasty constitution keeps handcuffing him from doing what he would like to do. No, he admires Putin greatly. He admires North Korea greatly. I believe he admires Iran even greatly. He certainly admires China, even though he has to put them down publicly. No, he admires strongmen. And and I know it's getting a little off the topic, but it has to do with Ukraine. If the Republican Party sweeps the midterm elections in November, if a Republican becomes president in 2024, I believe our support for Ukraine will absolutely crater. And that would be an unbelievable catastrophe for the West.
Absolutely. I think both analysts and the Western media tend to see things in isolation. So you had the invasion of Crimea, you had the invasion of the Donbass, you had the interference in the US elections, you had, to an extent, Russia pouring oil onto the fire of Brexit, and the same in the Yellow Jacket protests in France, secessionist threats in Spain. They've been busy leveraging these kind of divisions and throwing petrol on flames throughout. What do you think? I
Well,
mean, in Putin's mind, these things are all linked. In our minds, these are all separate events, but he's fighting a war against the West. And in his mind, these are all strategies to win.
well, just remember how disparaging Trump was towards NATO. If he had won a second term, I guarantee you we would not be part of NATO right now. And if we were not part of NATO right now, what would have happened? What would be happening right now in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe? So if the Republicans sweep the midterm elections and control the government, House and Senate, if a Republican wins the presidential race in 2024 and then controls the entire government, I would not be surprised if another move is made to either pull out of NATO entirely or to greatly reduce our influence in NATO and our support. And you know as well as I do, if the United States is not a part of NATO or does not support NATO, NATO is a hollow shell. And that's exactly what Putin wants. And what that would do would be it would absolutely not dismantle, but it would disorganize NATO to the point where there would be fractures that would just open up. And it would be an unmitigated disaster, a disaster which Putin would just drive a truck through or a tank through, because that's exactly what he's been looking for. A NATO without America is Russia in the Baltics and Poland very, very soon. And there's no other way to say it.
And one of the big talking points, of course, in the last election was that if Trump had been elected, there would be no Ukrainian war. Everything would be wonderful. I think I've been trying to convince people that it would be far, far worse. Putin really believed that Trump was going to elect it twice. The invasion plan was on the table and would have happened. And at this point, Ukraine quite possibly would be losing or would have lost with Trump in the White House. Do you think that
If
that's
Trump was in
accurate?
the White House, if Trump was in the White House, there would be no Ukrainian war. That's true. Why? Ukraine would have capitulated because Russia would have gone unopposed. NATO wouldn't have stood against him. America wouldn't have stood against him. He would have just swallowed Ukraine. Yes, there would have been many, many, many casualties, but the war would already be over. The war would be over. So in one sense, that's correct. There would have been a very brief Ukrainian war. I'll put it that way. No, that's all nonsense. That's part of the delusion. That's part of the disinformation, part of the outright lies that that Trump and the Republicans have sold to the American public, to the Republican voting American public. Facts don't matter. And yes, that was something that was put out there, but Trump absolutely was cheering Putin to go into to Ukraine. So what do they think would have happened if he was president?
In fact, you know, he might be in Moldova now. The Baltics might have been rolled over. We could be in a very different situation with a Russian army that wouldn't have suffered the kind of devastating losses that it has done.
To be honest with you, Jonathan, I would not be surprised if Trump were president right now. Not only what you just said have come to pass, I would not put it past Trump and the Republican Party of the United States to have made some kind of a deal with Putin, similar to what happened with Russia and Germany at the beginning of World War II with
Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Absolutely, you got it. I would not be surprised at all if a similar kind of an agreement was made between Putin and Trump, and I sincerely mean that.
Given all of this, and all of this is unfortunately not so surprising for those who have been paying attention, but January the 6th has shown Western democracy to be extremely fragile and precious. How do we need to evolve it to make it more resilient and even survive, into the 21st century?
Of course, I think about that every day, as well as millions of others. One of the things in America that's a great failing, in my opinion, is that democracy often works against itself by its very nature. Freedom of speech, for example. I think one of the biggest dangers to America right now is, of course, social media, but also the toxic public airwaves. You mentioned Tucker Carlson, suspect or public enemy number one, if you will, in that sense. I see no reason in a democracy, in any nation that wishes to survive, to allow treason, to allow people to try to evoke violence, to try to target officials, to incite rioting, to incite crimes, to incite assassination, to incite the overthrow of the government. I see no way in a rational world where this should be allowed on the airwaves. I'm not talking tyranny. I'm not talking dictatorship. The reverse. You will get tyranny and a dictatorship if you allow your airwaves to incite millions of people to overthrow their government and install a dictator, which is exactly what the Fox Newses of America and the OANNs and the Breitbarts and all of that are trying to do. And so to answer your question, I think one of the first things that we need to do, that we will not do, by the way, is to get control of the airwaves. The FCC is a joke, the Federal Communications Commission, which oversees our airwaves. They're not going to do that. They're not going to allow any of that to happen. They're going to allow all of this violent rhetoric to continue. They're going to allow people like Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and the rest of them to incite the mob. And it's a mob for violence. And they're not going to do anything about it. So what should happen? We should enact laws that would curtail that, which would make them crimes, as they are in many countries. How long has it been in Germany, for example? You can't be doing Sieg Heils and promoting Nazism. It's illegal. Yes, some do it. And when they get caught, they get arrested and they go to jail. We have nothing like that here. We have free speech to the heavens, and it's killing us. Journalism needs to take sides. Excuse me. I know journalism should be impartial, but when democracy itself, when the nation is in an existential crisis, when it may not exist too much longer, journalism needs to do its job. I call it whataboutisms and providing both sides of the story. You can't do that. I'm sorry, we're way past that. The Republicans are not equal to the Democrats right now. The Republicans are a party of treason. The Democrats are a weak party trying to uphold democracy in their own way, but they're not the same. And for the journalists, for the media in America to treat them the same is killing us. It's killing democracy. And unless that changes, the Republicans and the Trumpists, the insurrectionists are going to win.
And of course, this point of view might be labeled as treasonous in itself, imposing limits on, is it the First Amendment, the freedom of speech? But actually, if you go back to the pre-Reagan era, there were extremely tight controls and restrictions, weren't there, on, libelous broadcasts. It was much more regulated back in the 70s.
Absolutely, absolutely. And now I'm forgetting the name of the fairness doctrine or whatever that came about in the 70s and 80s, where you were forced, producers and TV stations were forced to present both sides of something, even if it was wrong. They were forced to give equal time, which is what journalists do now. But you're right. America's always had limits on free speech. The old saw, the old expression, where you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. That limits your speech. You can't do that. Your freedom to punch stops at my face. There's all kinds of expressions about that. So freedom of speech or action in America has never been unlimited, and no sane person would want it to, because unlimited freedoms are called chaos. And most people that I know don't want to live in chaos. However, that is what the GOP, the Republican Party, is leading us to. I don't want to even get into the Second Amendment. We're obviously awash in guns. Not a day goes by that we don't have a mass shooting. It all comes back to our interpretation of the Constitution. It's a battle right now of what's called originalists and constitutionalists. Originalists believe that everything that was written in the Constitution is like the Bible. It's the Word of God. In fact, they do say that, the Word of God. Even though it was written in the late 18th century, when most of the technology was not even a dream today, everything they said cannot be changed and must stay this way. And they are trying very hard to bring us back 246 years to when the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence was written, and then 1789 when the Constitution was ratified. And they're doing a very good job. And if they succeed in doing that in the next two elections, we will not have America. This will not be the United States of America. It will be some other country. We may even have the same name, but it will not be the United States of America.
And let's make that connection between Russian propaganda, influence, active measures, and some of these pressure groups that are, I would say, distorting freedom rather than upholding it. It was shown, wasn't it, that actually Russia had a number of so-called sleeper agents within the NRA and with the GOP establishment. And then, of course, it goes all the way up to Manafort and many of the people involved in the campaign. So this does seem to be a very contrived campaign, something that's been invested in for quite a long time by Russia. They can't have had any guarantee that this particular investment would come off. So that, we must presume that they had other investments in other individuals that ran in parallel with the Trump team, I would have thought.
Absolutely. I mean, many people have already forgotten the Mueller report, mainly because it didn't do what they wanted it to do. The Democrats had built up such high expectations for the Mueller report that it was just going to be a gift from God, and that it was going to spell the end of Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And when it didn't, they just dismissed it. Look, the Mueller report had a very narrow focus. And as you said, it uncovered a treasure trove of connections to the Kremlin within the Republican Party, going down to many, many different levels and all the way to the top of the election apparatus for Donald Trump. So they proved very, very conclusively that people were not only acting on behalf of Russia ideologically, but were on the payroll. We're taking great sums of money from Russia to undermine American democracy. And yes, that was only one narrow focus, very important focus, but it didn't look at the entire United States. It didn't look at our defense industry. It didn't look at our military. It didn't look at our law enforcement or other intelligence agencies. And I can tell you right now, just based on that small sampling on January 6th, we have a lot of Russian influence within our law enforcement intelligence agencies and the military. Look how many law enforcement, both current and retired, military, current and retired, intelligence people, current and retired, were involved in the insurrection on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol. Many, many. I was flabbergasted. I was amazed, as well as many, many other people. How many people who have sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, to protect it against all enemies, foreign and domestic, were in the Capitol that day, trying very hard to kill our elected representatives, trying very hard to stop the free elections, to stop the inauguration of Joe Biden, a legally elected president, to basically overturn our entire democratic system. That makes me more sick than almost anything else. The fact that we have police officers, intelligence operatives, military officers, all the way up to, I think, a few colonels were arrested, and everybody in between taking part in that. Some of them neo-Nazis, some of them obviously spouting Kremlin propaganda, whether they believed it or not, shows just how deeply whatever the Kremlin has been doing is working. Just that one microcosm, that one small example, to me, shows how horrible it is. And we just don't have the resources, to be honest with you, to investigate how widespread this probably is.
And I guess we'll never know how many of them were directly influenced by propaganda or even had connections with Russian handlers. Probably a small percentage, but many others will have gone along with it, having failed to notice how radicalized their own side had become, or simply didn't realize what was going on.
Let me just tell you one thing I remember from the 2016 election. Which, if you remember, Russia had greatly influenced in that election. They had a great deal of influence in that. I think it was MSNBC, maybe CNN, interviewed many, many people who voted for Trump, who had interacted on several social media sites that CNN and others had looked into and hired investigative firms to look into, and discovered that the vast majority of the social media comments that Republican voters were interacting with were coming directly from the GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence Service in St. Petersburg. They actually found the building and the floor of the building where all of these GRU people were operating. So they proved this pretty well. And CNN and the other news agencies interviewed people, Trump voters, who they found out had interacted with these Russian operatives, told them they were interacting with Russian operatives, not Americans, not Republicans. And even though they were told and shown the documents, they still said they don't care. They literally don't care if it was Russia that they were talking to. They still support Donald Trump and the Republican Party.
I mean, we are in a post-fact era, which is frightening, I think, for those of us who are interested in science, evidence, and at least the attempt to get towards, truth, such as it is. I think, so much of this is incredibly depressing. We should probably end on a question that is perhaps got at least an element of optimism to it. Let's assume that sometime next year, Ukraine wins. They push Russia back to the borders of 2014 and expel Russian troops from most of the territory. Whether that includes Crimea or not, that's obviously the big question that we have to sort of wait and see. What we face, however, moving forwards into the future is a fortress Europe, a new Iron Curtain. Whether that falls along the legal border with Russia or through the Donbass region, what will this future line of contact with Russia look like?
I think, and again, talking optimistically, that we will see a greatly enhanced NATO. I believe that even though they've had to be dragged, pushing and shoving and screaming, NATO does realize the danger for the most part. I do not think they will allow themselves, at least in the short term, to go back to the complacency that they had prior to 24 February. I believe they will continue to increase their military budgets. I believe they will increase their defense capabilities. They will build more tanks and jets and ships and ammunition. They will increase their military. I believe we will be looking at a fortress Europe, which, in my opinion, is a good thing, because certainly, no matter what happens in Ukraine, unless Putin is dead or deposed, he's not going to stop. We need this fortress Europe, this Festung Europa. It's crucial. And even if the Republican Party wins in the midterm elections here in the States, Biden will still be president for 2 years. And he will support whatever NATO and the EU does, even if he has to shame the Republicans in Congress and the Senate to do that. And he will. So at least for the next 2 years, 2.5 years, there will be support from NATO and the United States for doing that. What happens with Putin? Nobody knows. Of course, what happens to him happens to Russia. Even if he loses, as you said, in Ukraine, what will he do? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. It depends how he loses, Jonathan. And we've discussed some options for that. It really depends. If he loses very, very badly, there will be no Putin. If it's to the point where he does a strategic withdrawal, somehow saves face with the Russian people, then he's going to regroup. He will not stop. He has put out his manifesto starting in July of last year, when he said that Ukraine isn't a real country and that he's interested in basically resurrecting the Russian Empire. He does see himself as Peter the Great. Whether you want to call him crazy or not, he commands a very large military. And the sanctions aren't going to hit him fast enough to deter him from doing what he wants to do next. He's already got his eyes on Moldova. Georgia's certainly in the crosshairs. And he's already threatened Poland many, many times, and the Baltics. He's even threatened you guys there with a nuke, as you know. I don't suspect that's going to happen, but Eastern Europe is absolutely next. And depending on how badly he's defeated, that's where we have to look. And the only thing that may stop him is a strong, united NATO, which at this point, I'm optimistic will exist and will deter him.
And I think, led by Eastern Europe, there's a new note of pessimism in that even if Putin loses and is deposed, whoever replaces him could be equally, if not more hardline than he is, and isn't necessarily going to be someone we can do business with. It won't be Alexei Navalny and a great liberal wave of reformers.
No. Look, it's been proven by many, many people smarter than me that Russia's not going to change very fast. I have written about this extensively over the last several months, if not year. Russia is a basket case. Russia right now is a lost cause, in my opinion. It just is. Not permanently, not for all time, but for at least one generation. They have been brainwashed so thoroughly, and Putin has put his fingerprints on every part of Russian society and corrupted it so badly that there is not going to be any change for the better, even if Putin is deposed, killed, exiled, jailed. And as you said, there's a good chance that there would be even a hardliner worse than him that would come into the play. And what would they want to do? They would then want to prove to the Russian people how much tougher and how much better they are than Putin, because Putin already has the Russian population riled up for a war, for taking over Europe, for resurrecting the Russian Empire. They're ready for this. And make no mistake, they will support a push to resurrect and recreate the Russian Empire, certainly to take back Eastern Europe and try to recreate the Iron Curtain and the Warsaw Pact, something along those lines. They're ready for it. So no, even if Putin goes, the West has to be prepared for a very aggressive and hostile Russian for the next foreseeable future.
And of course, we have no capacity to change their minds. We can't reverse that brainwashing. We can't do what was done in Berlin after the war. And even that took a couple of generations in order to change hearts and minds in Germany. And there's no chance of us occupying Russia to do the same. All we can do, I think, is build our defenses and deny Russia the capability to act on its intentions.
No, and not only that, Jonathan, you're right. But the sanctions will work. I know I said right now they're not doing a lot, but they will work if we keep them and if we strengthen them. We will eventually choke Russia to death financially, or at least have a great deal of influence on what they do. But if the cracks that are already starting in Europe and America continue, no, of course it won't. If we allow China and India and Iran to supply Russia with the food, logistics, and military equipment that they need, no, of course not. This has to be an international effort. There has to be the sanctions and then the follow-up to the sanctions, the enforcement of the sanctions, which so far, to be honest, has been lacking. Right now, the EU is looking into that. They're having a lot of conferences on that topic, enforcing the sanctions. Hopefully it's not too late, but eventually that will work. But it's going to take a long time. As you said, we're not going to be invading Russia anytime soon. We can't force the Russians to look at Irvin and Bucha and what they did there, like the Germans were forced to see the concentration camps. That's not going to happen, at least not for a very, very long time. And Putin is isolating them. He's cutting off the internet. He'll go even further in that in the near future as well. So he is making a huge North Korea where they're only going to know what the government, the Kremlin, wants them to know. If anything, they are becoming more dangerous, not less, regardless of what happens eventually in Ukraine.
Absolutely. And anyone who doubts that should see the incredible stories that are being written by Russian dissident journalists at the moment, looking into the restructuring of the education system along Soviet lines, complete brainwashing from the cradle to the grave, but this time not in the service of a communist ideology, but in service of extreme nationalist imperialist ideology.
We're seeing the worst of the Soviet Union combined with the worst of Tsarist Russia, combined with the worst of Putin's Russia in modern technology. We're seeing the worst of all of that because as bad as it was, and you just touched on this, at least with communist Russia, with the Soviet Union, they were trying to pursue an ideology. They wanted to conquer the world for international communism. As misguided as that was, that's what they believed. They don't have that now. This is pure aggression. This is pure greed. This is pure tyranny. They want the world to become Russian, the Russkiy Mir, and they don't care about anybody else. To them, everyone else is Untermensch, the flip phrase of what the Germans used to call the Russians, subhuman. And they truly believe that. At least many, many millions, a great percentage of them do. And unless they are stopped by either a strangulation of their economy to where the Russians have no food in their refrigerator. And by the way, they refer to themselves as the refrigerator economy. They'll support the Kremlin all the way to the grave as long as when they walk to the refrigerator, they have food. When they stop having food in the refrigerator, they march on the Kremlin. Well, that's a long way from now. And so they're not going to be marching on the Kremlin, and he's going to make sure they have food. Maybe not as good as before, but enough. And so we're looking at a very, very dangerous Russia, not ideologically driven, purely militaristic, to take back an empire that never was in many respects, but an empire, and to crush all who disagree with them, and they have the nukes to back it up.
David, that is a truly pessimistic note to end on. But I really want to thank you for your time and incredible insights that you've provided. And of course, do please keep up your spirited defense of Ukraine on social media and within the intelligence community. Let's hope that victory comes as soon as possible.
Thank you for having me, and I believe Ukraine will prevail.